Hi everyone, this is Tim Von Rueden with cgcookie.com, and in this video tutorial I'm going to take an in-depth look at drawing the eye. And rather than give you a step-by-step as to how I draw a pretty picture of an eye, I really wanted to go in and explain myself as to why I'm adding things like the different shapes and forms and give you some visual clues to help you feel more comfortable drawing the eyes for yourself. So with that, let's get started. So before I begin the actual drawing process, I want to point out how important it is to observe eyes in real life and just look at photos of people and observe their eyes, see how the differences in the shape and things that you might not normally notice from an actual drawing of the eye. So what I created is just a simple reference of myself and my eyes, because you are your own personal best reference. Always there to use. You can always go into a picture of yourself, or if you need to, you can take a picture. And I know it might seem like it borderlines on narcissism, or you might be embarrassed to, but really there's nothing wrong with taking a picture of yourself for reference, especially if you need something in like a pose or a certain anatomy structure. So like for this one, for the eyes, I noticed that my eyes are very almond shaped and they have these deep set pockets, and that in different lighting you can see how the color of the eye changes. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be taking my eye as a personal reference to create an eye as a drawing. And also included with this tutorial is this eye reference, and this is the same one that was included in the Natalia series. And what this is a chart that pretty much gives a rough guide to drawing the eye. So you can see here it starts off with the eyeball as a sphere, and it has the eye surface texture. Then I go through the iris and how it's more of a concave with a convex cornea coating right over it. And then I go through the skin folds and then the different shapes that the eye can be in. So like I said, I'm going to start with an almond eye, and I'm going to go from there. So in the actual Photoshop canvas, I'm going to do this on a new layer, and right away I'm going to go ahead and start this off as a sphere, because I think people sometimes forget that the eyeball is actually a sphere underneath all that skin. So with my shape tool, I'm just going to make it a line. So this is the eye from the front view. And I'm going to collapse that layer down into one. So now I have that sphere on its own layer. So the next important thing to remember is that the iris and the pupil, that middle circle that I'm going to be drawing, is a little bigger than a third of the actual height of the eye. So if I could just copy this and paste it, I'm going to shrink it down. So the actual size of this will be larger, a little larger than if you put three of them stacked up on top of each other. So it's a little larger than a third of the eye. So I'm just going to put it right in the middle. And then, just to get a nice filling on it, I'm going to do the paint bucket tool and just fill in some color. Then I'm going to have one layer where I'm going to write all this in. So what many people consider the white part is definitely not the color white. You don't want to assume that the color of your eye is white, because that is the color of the highlight that you will be adding to the eye. So the color of the actual sclera can change depending on how much light is being shown in the picture, and you can even see in the reference, like some of them, they really do look closer to white, but even still, if I color pick, you can see how even the ones that seem the whitest are still partially gray, and then the ones that are more with shading, you can see that their color is a much darker, almost red gray. So I'm going to go ahead and write that in really quick. So this is sclera. And the color part of your eye is the iris. So now, the very center of your eye, which is the pupil, think of it more of a hole that is in the iris rather than a shape on its own. So if I go in and lay this right in the center of the iris, so the pupil is that hole that pretty much will expand or contract based on how much light it is receiving. So on a really bright day, it's going to get really small and let in little light. But then when it's a really dark scene, their pupils are going to expand, and it's going to try to allow as much light into the eye as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and write that in too. Okay, so I'm going to hide those for now, and I'm going to go into explaining how to actually shade this. So what you don't want to do is you don't want to assume that this eye is just a solid round shape that you would shade like a normal sphere. Like if this was a drawing 101 and you're shading in a sphere, you don't want to shade it like that. Rather, you want to pick an initial direction that the light is coming from, and then understand the different forms that we're going to be playing with. So down here you can see how the actual iris is a concave shape. So it's being pushed inward. So the way that the light would be hitting it would be different and would be drawn different than the actual white part, the sclera of the eye. So if I go ahead and I'm just going to grab this. So I'm going to have the light coming from this upper right direction. If we can imagine that this the sphere of the eye is just being shaded like a basic 101 sphere, then yes, this is the one part where you can say that it's shaded just like a round sphere, nothing really special about it. Except you will notice that the texture of it isn't a smooth, perfectly smooth texture, where it's going to be a little bit more of a clouded mix, and that's because your eye is not a perfectly flat surface all around. It definitely has a little bump and edge to it. So now for the actual iris shading, you can imagine that it goes inward, and then that there's a little bubble or a contact that goes right on top of it. So and that's what will get that rounded shading, but even the contact itself is pushed out a little bit more than the actual sphere of the bubble. So if I grab a lighter color, and if we can imagine that the light is coming from, I'm going to turn this back on, or I'm just going to do this on neither. So if the light source is coming from this general direction, then on the actual iris, you can imagine that the light would be captured not here, but rather it would be captured down here. And it would be capturing it like in a pocket. So that's the one big mistake I see a lot of times, where the shading will just be this and then just cover it all the way down, when really you want to understand how the light's hitting the eye and how it is replaying it back with the color. So something you can do is you can go into an extreme detail with the iris, because the iris itself, if you look really close up, isn't just a solid color, that there are many slits that go all around it. And the way that you can kind of sum it up in concept art is you can imagine that that black part, which is the pupil, is the center of a flower, and you're drawing on the petals, which will represent the slits. So if I go ahead and, so you would do something like this, then you would just do it over and over and over again. Then you also can imagine that the iris splits about halfway from the pupil to the edge of the iris. And what I mean by that is that some of the actual petal slits are going to come about halfway, and the other half would continue around. And then I might have some of it going into the shadow. Depending on how close we are actually to the eye. So if you're drawing a character and you're doing a full body character, I wouldn't even recommend doing that much detail or focus on the eye, because things like this you're only going to see if you're really close. So doing it for a character that's more farther away, it would just be a waste of time, and you could be doing other things and you can move on. So things like this are really nice if you're doing a close-up piece or just an eye study like we are now. But other than that, I wouldn't recommend really going into detail. So now we have our eye, and it's all naked, and we have to clothe it with a cover of skin. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and copy the sphere that I made for the actual outside of the eyeball, and just make it a little larger. And then it would encase this entire eye. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hide all these other layers. And I'm going to just paint bucket this in. If you want to, you can imagine like that you're pouring the skin color right over the eye, and it's just dripping right over, and it just covers the entire eye. Now we have an eyeball that is encased in skin. So you could also think of it as like the skin is a chocolate to a little candy ball, and it just completely covers the gooey inside, which is now the eye. So before I split it open, I'm going to go ahead and insert this into the actual face. So I'm going to do this on a new layer. And then I'm just going to paint bucket it in with a slightly different color, so you can still tell the difference. So now the eye is pushed about halfway into the skull, and that varies from person to person, but for this one, I'm imagining that I'm going to draw the little eye slit. So if this is the closed eye, we're going to push the sphere of an eye into the skin and make it settle in there. So we're just waiting to reawaken the eye. I'm just using this as my visual reference, so I kind of know how big I should make this. Okay. So now if you can imagine that the skin that's covering the eye and the skin that's covering the face are two different things, it's easier to kind of understand how the different folds then work. So if we start to open this eyeball, so if you grab this slit right here and then pull it up this way, just following that natural curve of the sphere that's underneath it, then the skin that is being pushed right here is going to create a fold on the face. So then on these areas, these are the different folds that I am talking about. So this upper one and the lower one. And that's because the skin is being pushed into the face skin, and it's creating these two shapes that you want to make sure you recognize. So now I'm going to grab that lower one. I'm just going to turn this layer down just a little bit. Okay, so if you can imagine that the skin is now opening from that slit, and we still have that covering, so there's going to be a slight ridge that is created. And this ridge is very important because this is one of the most overlooked parts of the eye that people either don't even add, or then they don't use it correctly. So then this top part of the eye would open as well. And you want to remember that that there is a sphere underneath the skin. So these different lines that I'm creating for the lower and upper are just following that natural form of the sphere. So now as this opens, that skin is being pushed down into the face skin, so it would create a lower one, which will be a little less intense. In some people, there isn't that much of a lower ridge at all, lower eyelid, but rather it's just darkened with a shadow. But then for the upper one, this one's being pushed directly into the skin right above. So it creates this deep pocket. And once again, this can also change depending on the kind of eye that you're going for. Sometimes the line might be even over covering the eye, and then that's where the ridge will start, and then this would be the upper area. But for this one, I'm just going to do the basic eyeball in the almond shape. So then this upper skin would be being pushed into the face skin. So I know it might sound a little confusing, but you're pretty much just imagining that the skin that is covering the eye is opening, and then as it's opening, it's being pushed into the skin that's covering the face. So that's what creates these two eyelids. So now I'm going to represent the first skin layer with this color. So now, I'm going to go ahead and erase the skin that is covering the eye. And there we go. So now, The important thing to remember about this lower ridge, and the thing that I was saying that most people use it wrong, is that this pretty much shows the placement of where the eyelashes start. So this ridge that we created is actually the line that which the eyebrow or the eyelashes would actually start from. So if I go ahead and make circle brush a lot smaller, so what you would do to do eyelashes, the first thing you definitely want to avoid is you don't want to do straight lines, because eyelashes have a natural curve to them and you want to represent that. So to do so, start from the base, and as you push outward, imagine that there's a small curve to it, and depending on which angle that you're facing it, so the ones that are from the directly in front of you will be a little tougher, because you don't want to do just straight lines down, but that's essentially what you're trying to do. So you want to imagine coming at you, so just always have that curve to them. Another thing is, don't be afraid to interlock and intermingle them. Eyelashes aren't perfectly aligned all the way from the start to the tip of the eye. The more irregularly that you add, the more of a realism sense you're going to add to it. So one thing you definitely don't want to do is start the eyelashes from the inside of the ridge. But that's nothing that I normally see. I just normally see them starting somewhere near the base of the eye, but without this actual ridge that sections it off. So now for the upper eyelid, since we can't see this ridge as clearly as we can see the bottom one, you're imagining the eyelashes coming out of that ridge and then coming outward. And the upper eyelashes tend to be slightly longer. So now for the ones that are coming directly at you, for the front of the eyelashes, instead of grabbing black, I'm going to grab a darker brown. There we go. They would seem like they're really short because they're coming directly at you and you don't get that side view of the actual length of the lashes like you do on the side of the eye, but rather you got to imagine that these are coming forward and that from a side view these would be appeared as very long lashes that you don't see from this angle. So I'm going to go ahead and clean this up everywhere. Just keep doing more passes on the eyelash. So now that the eyelashes are done, this little section in the corner of your eye where you see this little pink reddish area, that's a little bit of exposed muscle tissue that I'm going to go ahead and add in. And this is usually more of a wet looking surface, so you want to represent that when you're adding in your highlights just by doing little white dabs. But the actual underneath is just a darker pink or red muscle tissue. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and make those darker. So this would be the upper eyelid, and then this would be the lower. that would be the exposed muscle tissue. So these are the basic shapes of the eye that have a flat color to them. And what we want to do now is add some shading to it, and that would also introduce the cornea that covers the eye. And what the cornea is this plastic contact that I was talking about that covers the entire eye and gives it more of that wet surface. And how it reflects that light is very important. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to represent that first before I get into drawing the skin. So now, if you can imagine that there's a slight bubble in contact over the eye, and that it has this shape that goes around the eye. So it's going around it, and it's creating its own small little half sphere. So now if light was coming from that initial direction that we chose, which I'll make that darker as well, you can imagine that the light's hitting that contact somewhere around here. I'm going to represent this with a different brush. And that some of that light will be captured inside the iris, like we did when we colored that, but then the actual highlight of the light would be hit on this side of the eye. And then just to round out that outer edge, might add some things like this. And then on the actual eyeball itself, and you'll notice that now that we have the skin that's covering the eye, we have to place the shadows that correspond to them. So I'm going to grab that eyeball texture that I created, and I will drop this into the source files as well. So that upper lid would be casting a slight shadow. And this side would be darker because of the way that the light's hitting it, and since the light's coming from the other direction, the side's going to be catching not as much light. And then there would be more of a direct shadow under the actual eyelid itself. And where it actually enters into the skin, or at least it looks like that, but it's really just being covered. I'm going to add a slight shadow there too. And now the same for the iris of the eye. It's going to be catching, I'm just going to grab that color and then make it a little darker. This is going to be catching that shadow as well. And it might give it a little bit more of an outline, just to separate it a little bit from the actual the white part of the eye. But the thickness of the line that I'm adding in right now definitely depends on person to person. So some people have a really thick outer line, where some have very thin, almost non-existent one. Okay, now one little trick you can do is near the actual edge over here, where the eye comes to the exposed muscle, is you can just add in a slight lighter bar of color. Just a simple way to kind of separate the two. It definitely helps with the actual making it look like these two aren't just touching each other without any kind of separation. So then that muscle would be catching some of this light and then reflecting it right back. And that actually seems to be a little bit too dark of a red. So I'm just going to go ahead and lighten that up. Not that much, but just like that. Okay. So now with all of the eyeshadows in place, I'm going to go ahead and start rendering the skin. So I'm going to turn those layers off. And on top of my skin layer, I'm going to grab my skin brush. I'm just going to do some basic shading. So this is something I also represented in the reference sheet. You can see here how the shading of the eye is very distinct, and you want to make sure you pay attention to it. So if the lighting is coming from a slight overhead, which is what we're doing with this eye, then the way that it would work would almost be like a ladder, and the ladder would be from light to dark, from light to dark. So right now I'm doing the light part. So this section would be catching the eye, or would be catching that light, and the skin would reflect that. So then, using my multiply layer, I'm going to represent that the lower eyelid would be darker because it's not catching that light and it's in shadow. And remembering where my light source is, that shadow might be darker on this side. Whereas it comes around and meets the skin on this side, it might become a little lighter. So I'm going to turn that just down a little bit. So now that we got our light, dark, and don't forget this inner ridge, because this is something that you can add to it that will really polish up your eye and make it look, or add that another sense and level of realism. So this would be the next light tier of our ladder. So this one might even be a little bit more pink because of how thin that skin is right in that section. Like that. Then we would move on. So we got our light, dark, light, and then that underside ridge of the upper eyelid would be our next dark. But since we can't see it from this angle, just know that it's there, and if you did see it, that it would be darkly lit because of our direction of the light. So then our next light would be this upper eyelid. So completely opposite of the lower lid, which was covered in shadow. This one would be covered in light. I'm just going in and adding it in. And this would have been easier if I added the eyelashes on a layer all its own so that I could just draw right under. But since I have it on that one layer, I'm just going to go ahead and maneuver in between. At least the best I can. And I could just go ahead and redraw some of them on later. And then lastly, our last tier, which would be dark. And this usually goes into the section that is under the eyebrow and is normally much darker than the shadow that is on the lower lid. And that's because the brow might be pushed out further and causing the eye to be, or this section of the eye to be much more in shadow. So now where this skin fold on top of the eye meets the skin fold under the brow, I'm going to outline it with a darker line of black. And that just really showcase how the skin is being pushed into the actual head and the face. And it's giving this dark outline. So I don't want to go in and then add a line down here as well, because unless if you're doing a heavy eyeliner, there is no dark line that is under this crease right here. So I'll make sure that I show the upper one like that. So now from here is where I would do a lot of cleanup work, and actually before I do that I can work around this area. And the area that is around this muscle tissue, if I clean out the area just a little bit. So this could be a difficult spot, and you want to pay attention to it, because the ridge that is created is a very small one around it, and often you'll see a little light that is captured and reflected back. So you want to keep a little focus over here. And if I grab my skin brush again, usually in the pocket of the eye itself would capture a lot of the light. And then starting on that, the nose of or the bridge of the nose, you would get that different set of shading right there. But I'm not going to go into the nose, but rather focus on this little pocket that's created. And you can see that in the reference pictures a lot more clearly. So in areas like right there, this is why it's good to have that reference up, so you can kind of see where it plays in and add it. And if you want, you could add some of those smaller details like skin pores and all the other things that can come with skin. But I'm going to go ahead and focus on the eye. And before I do a polish up, I'm going to do one last shadow layer using the multiply. Just to kind of show a little bit better how if the light was coming from that way. We got our eyebrow somewhere around up here. These areas would be darker and intensified. And especially in that actual pocket where the fold meets the skin. Okay, so there we go. That is my eye. And I'm just going to do... And I'm just going to do a quick polish on it. But these are the basics that you need to know for the eye. And just remember that this is a sphere that is being encased in the actual skin on the face. So if you can remember that, you should be able to draw it and have no fear of the outside shape around it. And just remember that the skin folds are being pushed up and you're opening the slit of the eye so it can see. So I hope you learned something, and thanks for watching.